Well, we've got a lot to get through today. It's a couple of important, three really important chapters. I don't think I'll have time to get through all of them, but what I don't get through, I'll create an online thing or something for you, the way I did last time, I guess, Thursday. Everybody have the textbook now? Got a textbook? No textbook yet? Okay.
It was pushed back to the 17th.
Okay. So I think I got up through chapter 9, is that right? Or maybe,
Possibly.
I'm not sure. I think I got up to chapter 9 on there. Let me know what you need. I looked at some of my notes that I photocopied for you, and I realized some of those notes were kind of personal to myself. So now you're really going to look at them, I'm sure. So, all right. Geography of Indian Country.
It's up to chapter 6.
Chapter 6, okay. So you need more than that, beyond all the way through to next time, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's see if we can do that. What I'd like to do then is start. We're going to talk about today chapters 4, 5, and 6 as much as we can. Hopefully, I won't get too off track, but these are important. Very important parts. So we have chapter 4, westward expansion and reservations. Okay, westward expansion and reservations. And I'll start off by talking about some terms. And here are just these really aren't out of your textbook so much, but you'll run into them. First of all, Indian treaties. We know what treaties are, but the initial idea of a treaty was, of course, dealing with native nations in the sense that the United States would negotiate or make deals with foreign countries, international relations. This is why the Indian Office, when it was created in 1824, as you can see on the slide, the Indian Office was created in 1824, the very same year that the permanent Indian boundary was established, which includes the eastern boundary of Oklahoma. Not so permanent, but it was supposedly permanent. But anyway, in 1824, the United States Office of Indian Affairs was created within the Department of War. And, historians and others often point to the fact that it was in the Department of War that, the United States was at war with the Indians. It was not the case. The Department of War included offices that were involved with diplomacy as well as military action. So there was not a Department of State until the 20th century. And so the Department of War also included what would become the Department of State. And so that is the reason the Indian Office was initially placed within the Department of War. Of course, today we refer to the Indian Office as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we know that that's within the Department of the Interior. It was reassigned to the Department of the Interior when the Department of the Interior was created in 1849. In 1849, there was a big reorganization of administrations in Washington, and the Indian Office was moved because it made more sense for the Interior Department to deal with it, because the Department of the Interior was focused on internal things and especially with regard to land and federal lands. So later on, the Bureau of Land Management, the United States Geological Survey, when it would be created, the federal, the agency that's associated with irrigation. Anyway, there are a lot of different internally land-focused offices, and that has really more to do with the fact that it was moved to Interior. It wasn't to disregard disrespect Native peoples. There are plenty more things we can accuse the government of here today. All right, but that was just the basic reason. Now you'll see a lot of references to the Indian Service. Okay, so I've dropped down to the Indian Office here, obviously. The Indian Service was the term that was used for the field and, well, the Washington, D.C. based and the field based agents of the United States Office of Indian Affairs. The way I like to think of this is that, let's back up a little bit. With regard to Indian treaties, Indian treaties were created largely to gain cessions of land, all right, and to perhaps ensure some level of peace between Native peoples and United States settlers. But we'll see some patterns here, and I'll show you these. Anyway, the government would typically want a cession, and what that would do is, you remember, original Indian title is automatically extinguished when the United States takes possession of the land. So treaties of cession move land that's in Aboriginal title, at the time referred to as original Indian title, moves that into, it removes that completely. The United States then takes over that land. Well, most reservations today are not original Indian title. Most reservations today are lands that were established by treaties or executive orders as reservations. So the difference is that original Indian title doesn't exist, but recognized Indian title exists. So recognized Indian title is the creation of, it's the creation of an exclusive use of the land by a particular Native group or groups within a particular reservation. And as you've read, that pretty much is completely controlled by Congress. Congress can take it away at any time. So there was, and there's reference within this reading to, and there's, if you go up to South Dakota and talk to, Oglala Lakota people, or any of the Lakota groups, they will tell you that the Black Hills are still unceded Indian title land. They're unceded lands because they were taken by force. So, in a sense, they still have a claim to that. The federal government tried to eliminate or tried to get rid of that claim in 1980 by offering the Sioux tribes $200 million. That's in 1980. And the Sioux said, no thanks, we want the land back. And so anyway, there is original Indian title out there. There are still claims against the government for based on original Indian title. But most reservations are recognized title. That is, the United States government received it through a cession, through an Indian treaty, and then reassigned it to maybe the same group or another group. And now that's considered Indian country, but it's reserved. And the analogy here that I'd like to bring up is that in the 1890s, and a little bit earlier, the United States federal government, in an attempt to stop illegal logging on federal lands, they established what we know today as national forests. At the time, national forests were called forest reserves. And it basically is federal land reserved for a specific purpose, and that was preserving the forest or utilizing the forest for commercial purposes, but being able to regulate the forest. So a reserve is any type of federal land that's reserved for that specific purpose. In this case, an Indian reservation, or an Indian reserve, as they were sometimes called earlier, is the reserve for the exclusive use of one or more Indian tribes. And that exclusive use implies the right, remember the rights under Indian title, the rights of possession, the rights to use the land in its original purpose. And a federal Indian reservation all federal Indian reservations were created to allow a Native American tribe to subsist into the future. The idea being that Native peoples would, learn agriculture as if, some of them didn't already live through agriculture, cultivation. So the idea was that agriculture would be the way of tribal people supporting themselves. Now that's not really, future looking, but at the time that was the idea. That idea has been interpreted over and over again in the courts to mean the land or the tribe who's on a reservation, even if that's a reservation created through recognized title, the Indian tribe has every right to the natural resource base within that reservation. They also have every right to utilizing the reservation for economic development. So, farming anymore doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So they're recognized as having exclusive rights to water and to other natural resources that are within the boundaries of a reservation. Okay, so basically I mentioned this earlier. There are two types of Indian country before allotment. There are unceded Indian lands with original Indian title. Most of those have been eliminated, and ceded land without original Indian title, but then reserved for tribes by treaty. In the treaty, at least initially, the treaty was considered the law of the land equal to the Constitution, right? So any questions about that? Okay. Whoops. Sorry, backwards. Now, a little discussion about Indian treaties themselves. By the way, I'm going to draw down the bottom here. If you're interested in looking at any of the many treaties ratified and unratified by Congress, then you can go to the OSU library website and search for Indian treaties, or this is actually just they're photocopied PDFs of a publication that was in about 3 volumes called Kapler's Indian Treaties. It has a long title, but it was by an editor by the name of Kapler. And what he did was he pulled all these treaties together and put them on paper so anybody can read them. But if you look at those, you'll see a very, very identifiable pattern, and that this is not comprehensive, but most of the treaties, started off with a recognition of the rights of the negotiators to engage in negotiations. So there's on this side we have such and such from the United States Office of Indian Affairs, authorized to negotiate with the headmen and chiefs of the Sac and Fox tribes. So, or whatever group. And the point there was to try to create some sort of legitimacy in this negotiation. So the leaders are recognized and identified by name and they later would sign the treaty at the bottom. If they didn't speak English, then often they just signed with an X or a cross, and that was witnessed to be his mark. Okay. Now the problem, of course, is that the assumption is that all native peoples or native groups had some form of supreme leader or a group of supreme leaders, or some sort of representative council to speak for everybody in the tribe. And of course, we know that's far from the reality. Even the most organized tribes were frequently divided into local towns. They existed with local representation. And it was pretty common for native groups to have a very different political culture than what was expected by American negotiators. For example, if there was a really divisive dispute, it was often the case that the minority group who had an opinion different from maybe a larger group, they would simply retreat into the background and not be a part of whatever was going on. So, politics operated very differently in so many cases. Nevertheless, the United States tried to recognize individuals, and a lot of times those people were marked for assassination. Tribes recognized, and this is another part of the treaty, the tribes were to recognize United States sovereignty and to promise to remain at peace with the United States, to return any captive non-Indians, which was the case at times. And before treaties of cession, the boundaries were, this is like if there was a treaty that involved, and like an initial treaty with a tribe that had never made a treaty with the United States. First thing in that first treaty would be a boundary between the United States and their domain, at least the area that they had control of. And then in the Treaty of Cession, we got very specific. In treaties of cession, boundaries were identified and promises were made on either side to respect those boundaries. Very, very important, and often very different from what reality was for Native peoples. Many Native groups had overlapping degrees of possession of land. The Cherokees, for example, had a large area in this western North Carolina, the mountains of western North Carolina, North Georgia, a little bit of Alabama, East Tennessee, and originally up a little bit into South Carolina and up into Virginia. Now the Cherokee territory was gradually cut into a smaller territory that was mostly in northwest Georgia. But even before even after a lot of the treaties of cessions, more traditional Cherokees would, they would hunt, and they would go on long seasonal hunts up in Kentucky. And at the same time, they would overlap with other groups coming from the north, like the Shawnee and maybe the Delaware, who also claimed Kentucky as maybe a hunting ground. And the Cherokees, until about 1800, routinely went west to wage war against their arch enemies, the Osages. And so it was, there was no confining a group of people to a certain area in any sense of reality. But nevertheless, to establish this, what you might say is an imperial process by the United States, it had to create these fictional things. It had to create boundaries, had to create the idea that there was representation by small, by certain individuals. had to create this idea that there could be boundaries and boundaries that would contain groups of people. All right. Now the treaties of cession, which which ceded land to the United States, was usually done in return for some sort of compensation, some sort of payment. And over time, that payment became fairly standardized. It included what are referred to as annuities. An annuity, you all probably know what an annuity is, if you're working full time and all that. But the annuities that were promised to the tribes in these treaties were usually a certain thing that was promised in perpetuity. Annuities in perpetuity. What does that mean? It means a certain amount of goods in exchange for that land that they ceded forever. Now, what do you suppose if the Congress is making promises for eternity? What's going on in the minds of these people? What's going on in the minds of these people in Washington who are planning this?
They don't think that they'd be around long enough to collect.
There was this unmentioned assumption, sometimes mentioned, but most of the time unmentioned assumption that the Indian tribes were just going to disappear. They were going to die out, or they were going to become assimilated, or both. Now, Indian populations did plummet during the allotment period. They plummeted to their lowest point right around 1900. But after that, Native American populations have rebounded. Okay, and then later on they would change because of self-identification. A lot of and there's a good argument to say that a lot of Native American people suppressed their Indian identity during the allotment days in order to have rights of the non-Indians. But later on, after the civil rights movement and the rise of ethnic pride, a lot of people started tracing their ancestries and identifying themselves as Native Americans and receiving citizenship in a lot of cases from Native American tribes. So original Indian title is extinguished. There's this annuity that is promised in perpetuity, often taken in gifts and prizes, and Wheel of Fortune, right? And the original Indian title is extinguished. The reservation was designated, and the terms of that reservation, like whether or not people could leave or not, or the whatever and whenever the reservation was made, sometimes came with strings attached. The Plains tribes, for example, we'll talk about two treaties by the end of the day, that they were pretty restrictive in terms of the idea was that those reservations were containers for these groups, and if they wanted to leave, they wanted to cross the reservation boundary, they had to get permission from the Indian agent. So that's pretty restrictive on your rights. Any questions so far? And again, I apologize about, I provided you with PDF versions of the chapters since you don't have those, and if you run across any notes, all my notes are intended to be personal to myself, okay, not to you all. So anyway, I use profanity sometimes. I don't really need to. It just gets me upset sometimes, okay? And I'm not upset at the government most of the time. Sometimes I'm upset with the way something is stated, by the author, but I'm sure he's a wonderful guy. Actually, I think the book is really good. There are a lot of typos, but besides, he has a lot of really good ideas in this. I'm actually really happy I got this textbook. So, all right. What were the intentions of Indian reservations? They involved the recognition of a recognized Indian title. So that was the right to possess the land, a right to use the land for subsistence in perpetuity, okay? And a right to not be dispossessed of the land without their permission. I'm going over these things because if you read the chapters, you realize how these promises were just thrown out the window. Usually by the Supreme Court. Usually by a very docile, spineless Supreme Court. Okay? Anyway, tribal prohibitions on disposing of land to any entity other than the United States government. Well, that goes without saying, doesn't it? The United States has always required that. But these two in particular, a right to live off the land and the right to not be forced to be dispossessed of the land, those would be run over all the time. So, and I keep referring to this point because you will see it in later chapters, and it becomes really important when we get to things like water rights. So anyway, the assumption was that subsistence would be by way of agriculture, but of course, times change, right? In your first reading, chapter 4, the report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and there would be an annual report to the Secretary of the Interior by the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the boss in the Indian office. And then there would actually, you can go look at these. The collections are not perfect, but each year, the Secretary of the Interior had to report to the President and to Congress. But within the Department of the Interior, each agency supervisor, in this case, the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs, would report to the Department of the Interior. And the most interesting part of these reports is what the Indian agents report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. So in other words, you can find really interesting events, things that historians haven't even touched on, in the reports of the agencies to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Every year, they'll talk about populations, what took place during the year. And of course, it's probably not all, probably a lot of window dressing on those reports, I suppose. The Indian agents painted a rosy picture typically to make it look like they're doing such a great job. All right, anyway, in that report, this is usually cited as sort of the beginning of a policy of reservations. Now, you know that there were reservations created before this, but this is sort of the inaugural report that describes what the policy would be. And what did you think of that report? You remember reading anything about it?
Page 76 through 78.
Essentially you can read this and you'll see what's usually referred to as a very paternalistic approach to Indian affairs. In other words, remember what John Marshall said, all right? John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, referred to the Indian tribes as they're like wards, and the United States is the guardian of them and the protector, and they're in a state of tutelage, right? And so they're like students, they're like pupils, and so we have to teach them things. They're also domestic and dependent, and that would be taken to an extreme during this period. The idea of being dependent, and also even the the ideal of federal trust, holding lands in federal trusts, would be perverted by later justices and especially by Congress and the Indian office. So anyway, what this report did was kind of, it talks about how there is this need for peace between the white settlers and the Indian tribes, and it discusses how American Indian peoples should be schooled in Euro-American culture and Anglo-American ways. And that would include religion. So Christianity was considered to be one of those necessary facets of converting Native peoples to some form of Christianity, to remove what we refer to as the pagan ways or the primitive beliefs of Native peoples, and I'm using a lot of air quotes here. To instill ideas of capitalism, to instill ideas of what was called the Protestant work ethic, idea of daily work for life satisfaction, and sobriety, or the idea that one would resist temptations like alcohol. American citizens, the idea was that American citizens would become perhaps intermingling with Native peoples on reservations, and those people should be of the utmost moral character. So these would include people like missionaries, at least initially, and eventually, as this would evolve into the peace policy under Grant, President Grant, missionaries and religious groups were handed many responsibilities or many duties of the Indian office. So the Indian office actually cleaned house after the Civil War, got rid of a lot of corruption, and in the place of Indian agents who were sort of the lackeys in the army, who were assigned to the boondocks of the West, and were enriching themselves in some cases. Religious organizations were assigned to different reservations, and even to this day, you have some. A lot of tribes have some particular religious association. You ever notice that? And up in the Osage, if you go to Pawhuska and Hominy, you'll notice Catholic churches, and you'll notice Quakers, Friends. So I think both of those had some influence there. So anyway, the Plains tribes also in this report are really singled out as, these were people that we're just going to have to get nasty with, because they don't seem to be interested in settling down or interested in going to reservations. And one of the earliest references, I was really surprised to read this. I never read it, but it was interesting to see in that report an 1849 reference to a need to exterminate the bison herds. Because even that early, they realized that the Plains buffalo hunters, the Plains tribes, were so dependent on bison that if we eliminated the bison, we'd probably bring them to their knees. And that would happen in the 1870s, right? After the Union Pacific and the Transcontinental Railroad connected. Another thing that was really common was in most of these treaties, the people who negotiated the treaties, the chiefs or the headmen or whatever they were referred to, were often they often got a free trip to Washington D.C. And were showed they were shown the big marble buildings and the Capitol building and the White House in an effort to impress them, so that they would go back to their people and explain how it's a lost cause to try to resist this. Right? I mean, there's no point in it. Questions? Then I'll move on. There was a group of people referred to as the Friends of the Indian, and that's what they call themselves, the Friends of the Indian, like there was only one Indian, right? Or maybe they were only friends with one Indian. But anyway, the Friends of the Indian were these mostly wealthy, politically connected, and sometimes intellectual humanitarians. They eventually, later in the century, would meet as an organization at Lake Mohonk and refer to the Lake Mohonk Conference. And you can actually go to the hotel that they met in. It's a historic landmark in New York, upstate New York. These were mostly New England Protestants, people of New England extraction, Protestants, sometimes leaders of missionary groups or religious organizations that involve themselves in missionary efforts. And I think it's pretty clear that despite their ethnocentricity, they were pretty sincere. They wanted the best for Native peoples. They truly believed that that the United States was the chosen country, and that it would, we would eventually extend throughout the continent, and that manifest destiny was a real thing. They believed all this. But they were humanitarian enough to want the best for the Native peoples. They wanted to integrate Native peoples. Okay, they wanted to assimilate Native peoples, and this is, you've heard the term "kill the Indian, save the man" that eventually would come out of this. But they sought the adoption of agriculture for Indian survival. So farming became a real important facet of what would become the civilization program overall. One of the first things that the federal government started paying for with regard to Indian affairs, in addition to annuities and so forth, were they started sending farmers to Indian agencies. And these were like demonstration farmers. They were people who were paid by the government to sort of work a model farm on the reservation as an educational item, an education, sort of a, what would you call that? Sort of on-site demonstration farm. Oftentimes those hired government farmers didn't last more than a year or two, and so you had a constant turnaround. It typically wasn't very successful. And another thing we should keep in mind is that these New England Protestant, self-titled Friends of the Indians were coming out of they were coming out of a region that had not experienced Native Americans in a long time. I mean, it's not to say there weren't Native people still in New England, there were, but tiny minorities. And, they had a completely different point of view than, say, people out on the frontier of the United States, overstepping into Indian territory sometimes, right? So they were very different in that sense. They were a very good example, perhaps, of the cloistered academics, the ivory tower thinkers. But they had a lot of influence over the federal government because they had political connections. Your chapter here is mostly chronological, so also in 1849, you know about the California Gold Rush. And, whoops, do this over. Gold Rush, and Gold Rush, okay? So in 1849, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento, California. There's a very rapid influx of people into Northern California via San Francisco. And these people came from all over the world. They came from, mostly from the northeastern United States and the Midwest. There weren't a lot of Southerners. There were some. Southerners went along what's referred to as the California Trail, or the old Spanish Trail to California. But most of the people arriving on the gold rush came in 1850, 1851. And there were also people from Mexico that came north from Sonora and elsewhere to strike it rich in the gold fields. One thing that your author mentions is the idea that this created that it caused a lot of Americans to overrun the Plains tribes. Well, most of those people were on the Oregon Trail, which had a cutoff across Nevada called the California Trail. And while I'm sure it did increase hostilities, I don't think you can make a good argument that it deprived the Plains Indians of bison or something. But it did create a lot of hostilities. Now, what's the real tragedy of this story is what happened to the native peoples of Central and Northern California. The areas, especially the foothills of the Sierras and in the northern part of the Central Valley of California. These California tribes were typically small societies, typically really small societies, no confederations. They lived on mostly by gathering, some hunting, small game, and gathering. A lot of them lived on a diet a diet based on oak acorns, right, that they processed. Kind of like some of the foods that people in tropical rainforests subsist on, like anyway, I'll move on from that. Anyway, these groups were relatively small, not very well organized. Their technologies were among the least sophisticated native technologies in North America. Now, I'm not referring mainly to the coastal groups, the mission tribes and mission Indians that the Spanish had contacted for centuries before this, or at least the previous century. But I'm talking about the groups who were mostly in the mountains. They were pretty isolated. They were very isolated. Well, what took place? There's gold and then there are hills, right? And there were native peoples living in those places. The federal government and people in California realized that there could be Indian claims here. The mineral wealth of this place is in limbo, in legal limbo. But what happened was there's so many people that came into California so quickly that California didn't go through a territorial process. It became a state immediately. And but the mining interests realized the potential problem of having Indian claims to those gold fields. And they were able to get Congress to delay any recognition of tribal claims in California. Then what happened was the state of California was left to its own discretion, and the state of California, if you look at the I can't think of a more ironic title. The title of the document called "An Act for the Government and Protection of Indians." This is a California state law enacted on April 22nd, 1850. Right? And basically, if you've read that, it essentially takes away pretty much every human right of Native peoples by, in the very cynical sense of saying, here are the rights for the Indians. And, there's basically, Indians were way on down the scale in terms of their rights. There were actually, there's a really good book called, about this whole process. I can't remember the author, but it's the title is Pushed into the Rocks. And it's about the exploitation and the genocide at times, the actual genocidal hunting of Native peoples in the gold fields to eliminate their existence, to ensure that there were no Native claims to the gold fields, to the mineral wealth of California. So basically that, by Congress ignoring to California's asking, basically, Congress just kind of turned its back on Native peoples in California, and then it created this period of very, very tragic times for Native peoples there. Now, eventually, the state of California, would come under some federal restrictions, but it was a rapid tragedy. There are so many other things we could talk about during the 1850s. In the 1860s, of course, in the 1860s, in the United States, our history, we tend to think of the Civil War, right? And the Civil War was a time when the Indian agencies were staffed by typically the least competent government officials. And because most people wanted to be in the theater of war, right? But there were some interesting things that did take place here. Some of these are not mentioned in your textbook, but so without that, without much, there's not that the Indian office was that good anyway, but it got worse during the war. And what happened was you have the rise of these territorial militias, state and territorial militias, that pretty much ran rampant against Indian people. They were not subject to to U.S. military law or whatever. They basically were vigilantes, and some of the worst massacres of Indian people in American history took place by these state militias, like the Colorado militia under what was his name? Chivington. Chivington is the military officer who is quoted as saying, kill them all during the Sand Creek massacre. He was the one who supposedly, and my witnesses said, when someone asked, what about the women and the children? He said, kill them all, nits make lice. In other words, larvae grow up to be lice. The Dakota War took place up in Minnesota. And you might look at that and say, okay, did it take place in the Dakota Territory? Well, somewhat. But the Dakotas are, Dakota is a term for the groups of Eastern Sioux in the western part of the Great Lakes in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And the Dakota War took place while the Civil War was going on. It was a sort of an offensive, but it got started at an Indian agency, and it was a time when the Indian agencies were not providing any really rations for large groups of people during the wintertime, and you probably know the story, right? Is it discussed in the textbook? I can't remember. The story about how the Dakota War got started? Not familiar with that? Okay, well, there was this Indian agent, and I think it was in Minnesota, who was withholding rations, trying to manipulate politics within the tribe. After a while, people were starving. They came to the Indian agent to demand the supplies that he had in storage. And there was a remark that supposedly maybe the Indian agent or somebody else made to the Indians that, you can have all the hay you want to eat, and something along those lines. And that's what started it.
Tell them they can eat grass.
Tell them they can eat grass. Yeah, tell them you can eat grass. And so that's what brought on this revolt that led to a widespread murder spree or killing spree by this group of Dakota Indians. So it expanded. And then, of course, there was not a lot of military presence. Eventually, they were called into court, and there were, like 300 and some people who were indicted for capital murder. And how many of them? The largest mass execution in United States history.
38.
Was 38 hanged. But originally it was like 157, wasn't it? And then Lincoln.
Pardon.
What?
Lincoln, I think, commuted it.
Lincoln commuted sentences for most of them, but 38 were hanged at once. So anyway, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. So anyway, we'll move on from that. Indian Territory is mentioned in your text, but it was really a complex thing. There were always Southern Allied factions in most of the tribes, every one of them. The Chickasaws really weren't divided that much. They were pretty much all the way oriented towards the Confederacy. Choctaws, similarly, but there was a set of Union sympathy, or Union sympathizers. The Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation, in particular, were split. In fact, one of the first real battles of the Civil War in Indian Territory took place between Papalihola, who was a Union sympathizer who led a group of civilians. He was leading them into Kansas, and they were intercepted by Confederate Cherokees or Confederate sympathizing Cherokees, and I believe there were some Texas Rangers with them. But anyway, there was a series of skirmishes and one real big battle at the Battle of Round Mountain, which was supposedly, it has like 3 or 4 different supposed locations, but the best, most reliable location of that battle is right around Lake Keystone. So practically within 10 miles of here. Anyway, so the idea here is that the 5 tribes were oriented towards a confederacy, except for the most traditional people who tended to not farm cotton, or they didn't tend to be in the larger regional economy. They were subsistence farmers. So among like the Cherokee Nation, the majority of the Cherokee Nation were Union sympathizers, but the most powerful and most politically connected people in the Cherokee Nation were Confederacy oriented, because they were plantation owners basically, and big cattlemen. Now, why did they sympathize with the Confederacy? Well, the United States hadn't done quite so good things for forcing them to be removed from their homelands. But those more traditional people also realized that there was going to be hell to pay if they didn't side with the Union. The thing that happened is in 1860, a pretty high level general, right, in the Confederacy by the name of Albert Pike. Ever heard of Albert Pike? Albert Pike made a trip around Indian Territory and gained alliances, treaties of alliance with all of the tribes, or at least the factions, different factions of the tribes. Why did factions of the 5 tribes ally themselves with the Confederacy? Well, the obvious, probably, if you're from Oklahoma, the obvious answer is there were slave owners. At least some of them were. There were, it's a small minority who were slave owners, but they owned slaves. They grew cotton. Their economy was tied to New Orleans and to Texas. Another part of that is Indian Territory, shared boundaries with Arkansas, Texas, and Missouri was, southern Missouri was pretty much Confederate oriented. So that's the obvious answer, right? But it was bigger than that. It was more important than that. The Confederacy came to Indian Territory and they said, ally with us, and every tribe will have a representative in the Confederate Congress. Okay? They gave them a seat in the Confederate Congress. And to a lot of tribes, that's incredible, because they've been kicked around by the United States for so long, and now they were going to get representation within the government of the Confederacy. So that had a lot to do with it. Well, as I described earlier with Puffaloola, Indian Territory erupted into guerrilla war. The Union sympathizers generally left for refuge in southeastern Kansas, especially Baxter Springs, Kansas, that area. And the southern sympathizers, if things got bad, and things got pretty bad for them toward the end of the war, they tended to go to Texas and across the Red River. After the war, people came back, right? And there was still a lot of bad blood because a lot of the farms and homes were destroyed by opposing parties. Some historians have said that Indian Territory was probably one of the worst, some of the most destructive activity took place in Indian Territory through guerrilla warfare and it was more widespread than in the, except for maybe Georgia and South Carolina after Sherman got there. But, okay, anyway, the point is that in 1866, the United States shows up. United States Indian Office said, well, so we hear you had alliances with the Confederacy. So therefore, all of your treaties are hereby abrogated. And we're going to take all of your western lands, lands that you haven't necessarily settled yourselves, we're going to take all those lands. So this is when Indian Territory went from being all of Oklahoma except the Panhandle to becoming the present day Indian Territory that the High Court has recently found to be Indian country, basically the 5 tribes territories. So they chopped off the western lands and designated those for reservations for other groups. They would be assigned to other groups. And they required new treaties. And in every one of those treaties of 1866, basically Reconstruction treaties for the 5 tribes, in every one of those, there is a mention that at any point in the future, all the tribes have to do is just, shoot a quick little email to Washington, and we'll be there in a New York minute to survey and subdivide your lands so that you can take individual allotments. That was in the works in 1866. So allotment was something that was being considered, especially for the 5 civilized tribes, immediately after the Civil War. But 5 tribes were a little bit prepared, a little bit more prepared for that than most other tribes. They had lobbyists, who would go out to fancy restaurants with congressmen in Washington, D.C. I'm going to add a few things here. I wasn't able to put everything in PowerPoints, but the peace policy, U.S. Grant, became president, and Ulysses S. Grant's a pretty fascinating person. He gets bad, press for being an alcoholic, which in fact he probably wasn't. But he saw a lot of awful things in the Civil War, and he in his presidency was had very you wanted to see better things in the future. I failed to put the photos that I had for you, but I'll try to put them in the PowerPoint in the video here. I'll try to put some pictures in the videos for you. So U.S. Grant had sincere motivation to improve what had been really criticized. The Indian Office and Indian agents, during the 1850s and the first half of the 1860s had received horrible reviews all around. The Indian agencies and even the Indian Office was considered to be somewhat corrupt. Certainly, some people were enriching themselves in the process. They weren't there for public service necessarily. So what happened was Grant realized he had to clean house. He had to clean the Indian Office out. And so anyway, there were the others, kind of like the Friends of the Indians. Their Board of Commissioners of the Commissions for the Indian, or something weird like that. I can't remember exactly their names, but they're the ones that sort of blew the whistle on the corruption within the Indian Office. So U.S. Grant hired one of his very best friends and confidants, Eli Samuel Parker. Have you ever heard of Eli Parker? Okay. Eli Parker became Commissioner of Indian Affairs under Grant. Eli Parker was a Seneca. He was a sachem within the Seneca nation. He spoke fluently Seneca, whatever Seneca Iroquois language, and English. He was a lawyer. He was actually he went to law school, or he learned law. Then he went for the bar exam, and they wouldn't allow him to take the bar exam because he wasn't white. He didn't get all huffy. He just went about his life, and he met early on. He met some anthropologists, important anthropologists, that kind of gave him some advice to move on. He wound up going to basically a technical school in New York and became an engineer, like a civil engineer. This is all before the Civil War. He met Ulysses S. Grant before the Civil War in Chicago. Grant was from Ohio, but for some reason they met and became good friends. And when the war broke out, Grant was given control of the Union Army. Grant hired Parker as initially as an engineer, but he quickly got him to be his own. Essentially, Parker took care of all the correspondence between Grant and the rest of the military. So Parker, and I'll show you some pictures of him later, but Parker was also the son of a Baptist minister, an Iroquois Baptist minister. So he had some connections. He had information about the white world and the Native American world. He was respected among his own people enormously. Well, anyway, Parker became the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he was a big part of this peace policy. So, being Native himself, he's one of the very first Native people who had such a high rank. So anyway, he in the peace policy, religious organizations, particularly New England religious organizations, were given a role in the Indian service. They were the people who were considered to be honest and people who you could probably trust not to sell the supplies that come in for the Indian tribe on a reservation. That's where they began to place these religious groups in the Indian service. Under Grant or under Parker, they were able to get Congress to fund demonstration farms on reservations, and in particular schools, schools on and off reservation. At the same time, all right, during the peace policy, I want to make this point, but I didn't really think it was made very well in the text. You got to remember that during the peace policy, the idea that Grant had was to, sort of make a kinder and gentler Indian office and try to quell these internal problems. But at the same time, there was some volatility, especially in the Great Plains. And in 1867, an important, really 1867 and 68, really two important treaties that involved multiple tribes on the Great Plains were signed. The first one is the second treaty of Fort Laramie. The first one was like 1858 or something. The second treaty of Fort Laramie, 1867, established the Great Sioux Reservation. And a lot of that was unceded Indian land. The tribes involved were primarily all the Lakota bands and the Cheyenne, and I think some Arapaho maybe, but primarily the Lakota and Cheyenne, who were fairly well, allied. And in 1868, the Treaty of Medicine Lodge or Medicine Lodge Creek was took place up in sort of southwestern Kansas. And there is, at that treaty conference, were a lot more groups, a lot more plains groups and a few others, but they were mostly associated with the southern plains. And in that treaty, the government established reservations within Indian Territory, or what were by 1866, Western lands of the 5 tribes are confiscated, and these were referred to as just new government lands that were assigned to the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, and so those reservations then in mostly southwestern Oklahoma, were established. Also with the Wichita, Caddo, and Shawnee, Western Shawnee. So those reservations were established then, and that created lands within the Indian Territory that were unassigned. All right, that's really important. I mean, here in Tulsa, this was where we are right now. It was part of which nation? Like OSU Tulsa campus. Cherokees, yeah. This is Cherokee territory. But just a few hundred yards to our south, Creek Nation. Okay. I don't know, maybe a mile. I don't know what it was, but the line was right through here.
It says it on the freeway.
It does?
Yeah,
yeah.
It's about that big.
And then you get close to Keystone. There's like that little part of where you cut through Osage Nation, and then you're right back in the Creek Nation or something. Anyway, those signs, I've always often wondered, those signs started appearing about 35 years ago is when those signs started appearing. And I always thought, and some of them say reservation, but I thought, okay, why are these up? But now they have some real significance, right? Because the boundaries have a lot more meaning today. I'm talking about after 2020 and the McGirt decision. So anyway, we've got U.S. Grant trying to make peace, but on the plains, we've got these big treaties, and then we have Custer, all right? George Armstrong Custer, trying to make a name for himself, and his first, his first major Indian massacre is down on the Ouachita River near present-day Cheyenne, Oklahoma, and that's when he rode in at like 5:30 in the morning with the excuse that there were fugitives or renegades, whatever. They were wanted, like a few men who were wanted, who were being harbored in this encampment by the Ouachita River, right on the Ouachita River. Most of the men in that encampment were off on a hunting trip, mostly women and children in that camp. And Custer rode in and with the 7th Cavalry, right, annihilated old men, women, and children, primarily. That, for many years, was known as what? That event. The Battle of the Ouachita. Right? Today, it's renamed the Ouachita Massacre Site. So, what took place and what was taking place up in the north was that a lot of the several bands decided, we're not going to stay on a reservation. We're not going to agree to this. So they broke away. And therefore, the government had a reason to try to bring them in. And that's when the Plains Indian War really commenced. The 1860s, lasted until about 1874. So Indian wars on the Great Plains primarily. This brought a few new military bases to the Great Plains. But by 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad had divided the plains between a north and a south, also divided the buffalo herds into a northern herd and a southern herd. The United States also placed artificial price controls on things like bison robes and bison bones. Bison bones were actually used for fertilizer. Bison hides were used in all sorts of things. But essentially, buffalo hunters were officially sanctioned to kill as many buffalo as you can. People like Buffalo Bill got his start that way. By 1874, I think it was the Pawnee, or maybe several tribes, went out on their very last buffalo hunt and didn't have any success. They couldn't find them. So eventually, by the 1890s, bison were almost extinct. Okay, let's look at some legal stuff. Going back to the Cherokee Nation. In the treaties of 1866, there was this note that tribal commerce would not be subjected to taxation, federal taxation. Okay, we already knew that the states weren't going to have any role in taxing tribal commerce, but a tobacco tax was enacted in 1868, and so the Cherokees, or some merchants within the Cherokee Nation, filed a suit against the government saying that, look, treaty clearly states that we won't be subject to taxation, yet this new law includes us. And so it's referred to as the Cherokee tobacco case. Typically, in your textbook, it's just called Cherokee tobacco. So there was a ruling by the Supreme Court that basically started what we can call really the plenary power initiative of Congress. This is after the Civil War, particularly after about 1870. The federal government, Congress, begins to really just walk all over what has developed in the previous century. Maybe it was the centennial that had something to do with that, But what was found was that federal statute superseded Indian treaties if Congress wanted it. Plenary power, all right? And what that meant was any Indian treaty in the past could be altered or abrogated at any time. And maybe it was the 1866 treaties of Indian, with the 5 tribes, since they were considered basically, what would you call them? They ignored, they became, they were not, they didn't show allegiance to the United States. So I can't think of the word. What's the word? Anyway, they were guilty of what is it? Help me, Sarah. Help me. They were guilty of siding with the enemy. All right. Anyway. Insurrection. All right. I'm thinking of a different item that happened a little bit ago. What was it now?
Treason.
Treason. Thank you so much. Treason. They were basically guilty of treason, so that that enabled this abrogation, right? So after that, anything goes. The Congress said, well, we're in charge here. We have ultimate sovereignty. Any treaty, any Indian treaty at any time can be altered or thrown out, made invalid. So unless otherwise specified, Indian tribes are not exempt from federal taxation. Okay? And we know they're exempt from state taxation. But remember that this is before Indians were even considered to be citizens. Well before allotment an allotment provided a route to become a United States citizen. Before any Indian was a United States citizen, even Eli Parker was not a United States citizen, all right, because he was an Indian. And he was a brigadier general in the United States Army. So anyway, Indian tribes were not, or Indian people were not citizens, and the United States federal government said, we can tax you.
Yeah, so that brings me to, so based on the Constitution, not non-tax, that clause in there, then now all of a sudden they are taxed. Like even to this day, based on this article.
So they violated the Constitution of the United States.
Yes, so that's where I was.
And Congress, representatives and senators are sworn to protect the Constitution of the United States.
Okay.
But they blew it off. Exactly.
And then it hasn't gone back, right? Because like on Indian gaming, the per capita payments that they had, those are taxed.
Income tax.
Income tax.
Yeah.
So
Indian
it
people are
hasn't
subject to
gone
federal
back to-
taxes, period.
okay.
Yeah. Unless otherwise specified.
All right, got it.
Now, in some cases, like hunting and fishing rights, there's some exceptions, But those are usually state-based.
Since they're federally taxed, are they then represented within the House? And Congress?
Not until individual people became U.S. citizens voluntarily after receiving allotments, or in 1924. By 1924, 2/3 of Native people were already American citizens, but in 1924 they passed the law to make all Native Americans United States citizens. It's kind of pathetic that Native people fighting in World War I were not United States citizens, right? So anyway, but before that, basically they were subject to taxation without representation. All right. Chapter 5, allotment. I'm not moving real fast today. But I can speak on allotment maybe a little faster than other items. The allotment era, and by the way, your author calls this period from 1871 to 1934 the allotment era. And, when I saw that, I thought, what? That's not right. Allotment didn't start until 1887, even though it was mentioned in 1866, right? In the treaties. But if it were up to me, I would call this era the forced assimilation era, right? Because that's what it was. It was forced assimilation from 1871. Why 1871? Why is that a specific date?
The end of the treaties with the tribes.
Hmm?
The end of the treaties with the tribes.
That's when Congress just said, Congress just put that in an Appropriations Act. Oh, by the way, we won't have any more Indian treaties. Now, I've said earlier, though, there were agreements, right? There were agreements. So what's the big difference after 1871? There is a really big difference between Indian treaties signed before 1871 and agreements with Indian tribes after 1871. And I didn't realize this until I read your textbook, but it's a really good point. Anybody want to try? And it's kind of circular reasoning, I understand, because really Congress has plenary power, and if it wants to, it can do whatever the heck it wants, okay, whatever it pleases. But if an Indian treaty an Indian treaty is considered the law of the land, just like the Constitution, right? Supposedly. Indian treaties made before 1871 at least were negotiated by two different parties. After 1871, those official agreements, that didn't have that special word with it anymore, treaty. After 1871, what happened was the Indian tribe could negotiate with the government and come to some agreement. Then that agreement was ratified by Congress. However, since it wasn't a treaty, Congress had a green light to change it any way it wanted to before it was passed. So essentially, the agreement was not a treaty. It was subject to editing by Congress. Congress could put things into it, take things out of it as it wished. Plenary power, okay? Anyway, a forced assimilation era, or the allotment era, as your textbook author calls it. The General Allotment Act was passed in 1887. Initially, allotment was intended for the 5 civilized tribes as, sort of the test case. But the 5 civilized tribes fought it tooth and nail. Even before 1887, they saw it coming. But by 1887, they had managed to convince the government that they were different in terms of their territories because they held a patent in common to their lands. This was, they received a sort of an exchange for original Indian title, and that was exchanged to Indian territory. They received a patent to the land, and that patent was held in common like an estate. This would have ramifications later, and I'll have to talk about those. I don't think I've put them in a PowerPoint, but I will. We'll talk about them, okay? So let's go back to the basics of Indian of allotment. And the idea was, and that's also referred to as the Dawes Act or the Dawes Severalty Act. You've probably heard that. Henry Dawes was a New England senator who was a very well-meaning person, sponsored the bill. But the idea of allotment was, based in the idealistic ideas of what I would call presumptuous do-gooders and Western settlers. Okay, so it's a sort of thing that two groups who you would never guess would be allied. All right. Oh, like the Indian Removal Act, the General Allotment Act didn't actually allot any lands. It just provided for the federal government to negotiate allotment agreements with each Indian tribe. So this was, of course, modeled on the Homestead Act to a degree, 1862 Homestead Act, which was considered very, very successful. Okay, the Union did that to, get settlement into the northern states quickly. And so, what were the different ideas? Among the Northeastern do-gooders, the intellectuals who really didn't have much of a clue about reality, they were concerned about the conditions of Native Americans on the reservations. They had learned that the reservations were just full of poverty and alcoholism and crime, Indian on Indian crime, very, very negative reputation. Reservations were not working. The whole idea of the reservation process was just not working by the 1880s. So these intellectuals realized, they thought, well, why isn't this working? And they came to the conclusion that, well, nobody owns property on an Indian reservation. It's assigned to a group of people, but yet nobody can actually own the property. Nobody can actually own individual property in terms of land. if they can't own individual property, then they cannot really understand what we know as the Protestant work ethic. You know? So they couldn't really even, they had no incentive to try to farm. Number one, because the best lands might be competed for, and there were a lot of other obvious things, like Indian reservations were hundreds of miles from an agricultural market. They had no transportation. There was no really good access to equipment, and there was no money. So it was sort of, the do-gooders realized how stupid the reservation idea was. So they thought that, okay, if you could replace, and they called it communism. I've seen it in the discussions, and because they wrote a lot of stuff. These Friends of the Indian, the Lake Mohawk conferences, they would refer to the reservations as being in a situation of communism. What they were referring to was a communal land holding. Nobody owned the land. And if you didn't have that, you didn't have the ability to instill capitalism in the minds of an Indian, which is kind of stupid because Native peoples have traded and everything forever. But when it came to land holding, the communal land holding, they considered must be the reason for this poverty. Right? And it's also a matter of dependency. Native peoples were becoming more and more dependent on the government. So they thought if Native peoples could have their own parcel of land, they wouldn't want to be dependent on the government, and they might become industrious, and that would help them assimilate into the larger society. So they had decided that reservations need to be carved up into individual parcels, just like the Homestead Act, and so those were the intellectual do-gooders. Out west, places like Iowa and Missouri and Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, Westerners who were perhaps had gotten land with the Homestead Act, they were looking for more land. And by the 1880s, there weren't any good lands left. There's plenty of land, obviously, the Great Plains, throughout the Great Plains, but land where you had enough rainfall reliably to farm, lands that were close enough to markets to make sense to farm. There weren't many of those left, but there was one really big chunk of land that was left that was unassigned, and it was on the Southern Plains, really not really on the plains at all. So they started looking, and actually the landed interest, and this also included industrial interests like the railroads. They did the math. That is, they realized that when if you're going to give 180 acres to each individual within that Indian tribe, and there's like 800 or 1,500 people in the Indian tribe, but the reservation they're on is 7,000 acres, or 7 million acres, right? If it's 7,000 square miles, all you have to do is realize that allotment's going to just open up the vast majority of that reservation, and if the government opens that land to homesteaders would be happy. So Congress, of course, wants to make all the voters happy. These were referred to as the surplus lands, those leftover lands that would not be allotted to Indian people. And in theory, they were federal public domain lands because the United States still owned it. But if all the Indian people were allotted lands, then there would be no more need for the reservation. The Boomer movement, not mentioned in your text, gets started in around 1884, lasts for about 5 years. the Boomer movement got started in Kansas City and other smaller newspapers within Kansas. And one of the more important individuals who promoted this idea of opening the unassigned lands was a guy by the name of David Payne, who would later make a career in meteorology for Channel 9. Just kidding. Okay. All right. My favorite meteorologist, by the way. But David Payne was a political, or he was crafty, right? And what he did was he brought all this to the attention of the Kansas City Star newspaper. And so the Kansas City Star was like on his side and making an argument that it was completely unfair to the American people for the United States government to withhold this very good land from settlement by United States citizens. And so the unassigned lands were in the crosshairs of the Boomer movement. You know much else about the Boomer movement? Oklahoma history, remember that? 9th grade? Yeah, I don't remember much either. But,
30 years ago. No.
Coach didn't teach me very much. But actually, I had a really good teacher in 9th grade, Oklahoma history. In 1884 is when, and this is what they did to get more press. David Payne and his Boomers started doing these illegal entries into federal land, into the unassigned lands. They were told that, you're not supposed to be here. And they would set up camp and wait to get arrested. Okay? And so they most of the time they came to Stillwater Creek around West Day Stillwater, my hometown. And so they would establish camp, and then they would wait for the Army, the United States Army, to come eject them, or haul them out back to Kansas. And the one event that probably was so decisive that convinced enough people and got enough congressmen on board to open up the unassigned lands took place when the United States Army sent Buffalo soldiers out of Fort Sill, all right, black soldiers, to remove these whites from their camp in Stillwater, all right? And when that hit the papers, it was like, are you kidding? The United States had black soldiers remove whites from Indian territory, or from the unassigned lands. And the next thing you know, there's a plan to open the unassigned lands, which were open on April 22nd, 1889, right? So that's why Stillwater's motto is where Oklahoma began. Let's talk a little bit more about allotment. Some specifics about allotment. So here we go. The General Allotment Act authorized the Indian Office to negotiate allotment agreements with the tribes. First thing it did, it exempted the 5 civilized tribes from the allotment agreement. Okay, so the 5 tribes were not part of this, and I think a few other tribes, Klamath in Oregon or something like that, not a part of this. Maybe I'm thinking of something different, but in most cases, the agreements were, allotments were analogous to homesteads, except for the fact that women and children were discriminated against. Well, in the Homestead Act, you had to be an adult, right? But every adult was entitled to 160 acres. So it was often the case that, say 2 brothers and their wives would homestead in one large area and, be able to get a whole square mile of land. In the case of the allotments, 160 acres went to men, 80 acres went to women and orphans under 18, and 40 acres went to children under 18. Right? Now, that's one part. Something that was extremely different from the Homestead Act What, do you remember the Homestead Act? What'd you have to do to get title to the land, to get a patent to the land? A patent is from the United States government.
You had to improve it.
You only had to live on it for 5 years and supposedly improve it.
Oh.
But an improvement could be, planting a tree, whatever. But you just had to have an affidavit from a neighbor who, would say, basically a witness who would say, yeah, you were there for the last 5 years. I wonder how many times that was actually the truth. But, so 5 years, and 5 years and you got a patent. Now, my great-great-grandfather homesteaded right outside of Stillwater. And funny thing was, he didn't have to even wait 5 years. He sold his share before the homestead came up. Right? So he cashed it in early. At least that's what I think happened. So you could do that under Homestead Act. Basically you owned it. You weren't going to get the patent for 5 years, but you could certainly turn it around and sell it, and cash in on it, and then later just do the paperwork. In the case of American Indian allotments, each one of those parcels was referred to as a restriction on it, and that restriction referred to the alienation of the sale, the conveyance of that land to someone else. So there was a 25-year restriction placed on the alienation of the parcel. And the idea was, according to the most allotment agreements, after 25 years, the restrictions would be removed. The United States would issue a patent to the allottee, all right? And the allottee would then be declared as a citizen of the state in which it resided, and of course, also a United States citizen. So you got citizenship after the period of restriction, the period when you couldn't sell it. Now, why did they do that? Why did the government create a 25-year period before you could sell the land? Well, it was intended to be a safeguard against people getting swindled out of their allotments. There are so many great examples of unintended consequences in Indian history. All right, and this is one of them. The thing that was planned to be avoided, the plan that intended to keep people from getting swindled, actually worked easier to swindle people out of their land. All right, I didn't work that very well. So let's talk about this first. If you get 160 acres, and I take 160 acres, okay? If I got 160 acres and I was told, okay, this is yours to use, and in 25 years, you're going to be able to get a patent on it, and you'll be a citizen. I don't care about citizenship, but in 25 years, I'm going to be 80, right? Something like that. So I'm not looking, what good's it going to do me? I might be dead by then, okay? And that happened a lot. Of course, mortality rates were higher, right? But first of all, 25 years, are you kidding? Now, if you're in possession of this allotment and you can't sell it, what else can you not do with it?
You couldn't rent the land?
You could not rent the land unless you got permission from the Indian office. And that took a lot of time and paperwork and headache. It was very difficult to rent the land, to lease the land. And in fact, you couldn't lease the land for more than 10 years, even if the BIA approved it. So anyway, if I were to get an allotment or homestead, I would go, as soon as I got that patent, or maybe even before, I would go down to the bank and I would say, look, I got this land. It's worth 160 acres today. What would that be worth? About $640,000, something like that. So I got this $640,000 chunk of property. I'm in good shape for the rest of my life. Okay, so I'm going to take a vacation to Tahiti for a month. It's a lot of cash. But if you're an allotee and that land is United States land and you don't have a patent to it and you can't sell it, in fact, you can't lose it. That's the whole intention of the government. You can't lose that land. Then no bank's going to lend you any money for it because they can't get it either, right? No bank. It's really not capital. It's kind of a promise by the government. But you can live on it and try to make a living on it. 160 acres, well, okay, people could do that perhaps. Now, if you're in the high plains, and if you're in Wyoming and you get 160 acres of brushland, good luck farming it. All right, so the land can't be sold, therefore it can't be capitalized. Now, so if you get the land, if you get 160 acres, you don't even have the capability of going to the bank and getting a small loan to build a barn and a house and a fence and maybe some livestock. You don't even have that. So it's like they're land rich but poor, cash poor. Okay, so the land, after the 25-year period, if a person was able to land that patent, if they followed all this, then, and they got U.S. citizenship, then the land would become sellable, right? So you could sell that property. And the other side of that was, the state now has the state's going to impose property taxes on you because you're not a United States citizen and you have land in the state. It's just real estate at this point. And if you don't pay your taxes, then you're going to get them confiscated. So think about all those Indian allottees who, after 25 years, suddenly they've got a patent to the land, but they have no money.
And they had no real way to make money off that land.
Had no way to make money on it. Exactly. So what do you do? Well, I'm going to be, 79 actually. So I'm 79 years old. I'm not going to start a farm at 79 years old. But if somebody comes along to me and says, hey, I'll give you some cash for that land, I'm desperate, I'll probably take far less than what it's worth at that point if I want to sell it. Okay. Well, that's just one small possibility. Oh, and by the way, the idea of allotment was, the government's plan was to take the proceeds from surplus lands that were sold to white settlers, as if the government was ever successful selling public land. It wasn't. The idea was to sell that land, the surplus lands, the other 90%, and then use those to fund the operations of the Indian Office. Okay? How hypocritical is that? But it gets worse, right? It's a lot worse. In around 1904, 1905, a lot of people were complaining, who were allottees, especially in the 5 civilized tribes area. Okay. Oh, by the way, the 5 civilized tribes, they were exempted in 1887. What happened? In 1893, Henry L. Dawes himself came to Indian Territory, traveled around to all the nations with an entourage of government officials, trying to sell the idea of allotment. Actually, he was trying to sell the idea of a roll, because before they could allot anything, they had to get your name on the rolls. The Creek Nation, in particular, were a lot of the people in the Creek Nation were particularly resistant to allotment, to the point to where once there was an actual agreement, that the tribal government had okayed and signed off on. A lot of the more traditional folks said, catch me if you can, we're not taking allotments. So, go ahead, you can't give us allotments. But they did, they assigned them allotments anyway, without their, the idea was that most people would select their own allotment. Going back to the 5 civilized tribes, there was a senator, one of the first American Indian senators by the name of Charles Curtis, who was maybe he was a congressman out of Kansas. Y'all know what happened, where he eventually wound up, Charles Curtis? He wound up becoming vice president of the United States under Herbert Hoover. Anyway, Charles Curtis sponsored a bill that was actually titled an act for the protection of the people of Indian Territory and for other purposes, otherwise known as the Curtis Act of 1898. Okay? So basically this is what happened. Henry L. Dawes goes around Indian Territory trying to get rolls going, trying to sell everybody on the idea of allotment. He gets pretty much, stone cold reception. And so eventually they realized that the only way that 5 civilized tribes are ever going to agree to allotment is if we just force it down their throats. And so Charles Curtis sponsored this bill that was a it was a terrible potential law that would have established the forced allotment of the 5 civilized tribes. And it said, if the tribal government doesn't come to a negotiated settlement for allotment by this date, then the terms of this law will go into effect. So basically, it was holding a gun to the tribe's head and saying, you want to take the better deal? If not, you get this one. So they held out and they held out. I think it was Creek Nation that went first, 1899, something like that. Or they agreed to it about 1899, something like that. Cherokee Nation, I think, was one of the last ones, 1902 or something. So these agreements were different. The 5 civilized tribes allotment agreements, which were forced to the table with the threat of the Curtis Act. These agreements were very different from the allotment agreements made under the Dawes Act. Okay? They were different in this respect. All lands within the 5 civilized tribes' territories would be allotted to every citizen. Okay? All right, so you want a math problem? Here's one. Take 7.5 million acres, find all of the citizens of the tribe, and allow them to select their own allotments, and create a system in which all the land will be taken eventually. All right? And nobody knew how many people were in these nations. Nobody was really sure. To make things even worse, since 1870 or thereabouts, since the railroad came through in 1871, 72, there were by 1900, there was something like 4 whites to every Native American. There were plenty of people who had intermarried with people in the tribe. In some cases, were actual citizens of the tribe. But there were a lot more who were there illegally. They were referred to as, anybody know? Intruders. They were intruders. They were in Indian Territory illegally, usually at the behest of tribal citizens. Okay, so tribal citizens who had some property, communal property, they had control of some land, they would hire labor from Arkansas, from Texas, and elsewhere, and in sort of a sharecropping system, they would make money growing cotton or something. So there were all these in some cases permitted non-citizen whites, in some cases completely illegal citizens or illegal aliens into Indian Territory, right? And so, but they were not going to be removed. I often wonder if the meaning of an act for the protection of the people of Indian Territory actually meant an act for the protection of the white people of Indian Territory. Because what was also going on in Indian Territory, in the Five Nations, was that if you were white, one of the problems was that there were no schools, right? There were no schools in Indian Territory except for Indian kids generally. And like the different nations had their own schools. But basically the whites weren't receiving or enjoying the same sorts of rights in Indian Territory as they would in a state. Okay. So because I just wonder if that's the case. So an act for the protection of the people of Indian Territory, the Curtis Act, 1898, forced the Indian nations to come to the table and negotiate allotment agreements. Those allotment agreements required all citizens of the nation to receive the entire balance of the land within the nation. There would be no surplus lands. So they had to come up with this crazy scheme of divvying out land. And in most cases, there was what's referred to as a homestead allotment and a surplus allotment. Okay. So typically, an allottee in Cherokee Nation or Choctaw Nation, they would receive two allotments. They would receive at least two parcels of land that would equal their so-called share of the total estate. Now, that created another issue. Most people lived on their homestead allotment, which was by definition a smaller acreage. The surplus allotments were supposed to be larger parcels. And typically, they were larger parcels placed in areas where Native people had not resided. So if you were an allottee in the Cherokee Nation, your homestead allotment might be on 14 Mile Creek, in around Tahlequah. And, that's where your family lived for generations. It's where your house was. It's where, all your relatives were. You weren't going anywhere from that. And your surplus allotment was probably like, North Tulsa area, right? Somewhere like that. Or, like around Bartlesville or something like that. So they had these surplus allotments and homestead allotments. That meant there was a lot of, and they had a slightly different period of restriction, and I don't know what they all are. I know the Cherokees were 21 years, a 21-year restriction. They're analogous, close enough, right? All right. So in the case of Indian Territory, in the case of all allotments, by 1906, Congress had realized there were a lot of Native peoples who didn't need to have the government taking care of them and protecting them from losing their land, supposedly. And a lot of those people were in Indian Territory, right? A lot of those people were ready to take allotments. It's fine. And they complained to the Indian office that, this is crazy that we have this stupid restriction on this land. You need to get rid of this so that we can capitalize on it, so that we can make improvements and develop the region. So Congress, went to work and easily passed this bill called the Berkey Act. And what the Berkey Act did was allowed any allottee to file with the Indian office or with the Department of the Interior, file a request for a removal of restrictions. Okay? So it didn't take away restrictions. It allowed individuals to have their restrictions removed. Okay, fine enough. So a lot of people had the restrictions removed, and the land went into the land market. However, there were also some real issues, and these are described at length in Angie DeBose and Still the Waters Run. Has anybody ever read that? Anybody read that? It's a hard read. It's really difficult, but she documented stuff that was really when she published this book, and she had to publish it through Princeton University Press because University of Oklahoma Press got it. It was a fantastic book, all right? And she wrote it way earlier, way before 1940. She initially wanted to publish this book with the University of Oklahoma Press. And guess what? The acquisitions editor at the press read through the manuscript and said, "We'd love to publish this, but you name so many benefactors of the University of Oklahoma," they call it Oklahoma University. "You name so many benefactors of the university, we can't possibly publish this. We'll lose our jobs." It named a lot of politicians that were in office at the time. She named them and told exactly what they did, because she found it in the records. What happened with allotment in Indian Territory and elsewhere was that you had a lot of people who didn't have a lot of business experience. There were actually people that probably needed to have restrictions. In other words, a lot of orphans, and people who maybe didn't even speak English. But even without the removal of restrictions, these people didn't actually do it. But what would happen was you would get these schemes where lawyers, most commonly they were lawyers, would get lists of orphans from the courts. Okay, it was like in a public document. They would get these lists from the courts of all these orphans, and then they would go and file for guardianship. They knew how to do this. They would try to gain guardianship over these orphans and then old people. And typically they would give them a little bit of cash to sign off on this if they weren't children. But there became an entire business of guardianship, and the guardianships, being a guardian of these so-called incompetent Indians allowed them to do what guardians do. Right? A guardian has power of attorney over your property. The guardian can call the shots. And the guardian can sell the property, right, for the benefit of the person under the guardianship. And that's what happened. And in a lot of cases, the guardianships themselves were traded like commodities, right? Like stocks. And the United States District Court of Muskogee became the busiest federal court in the United States because of all these guardianships that were being applied for. And of course, what happened in about 1905 in this part of the country, just a little to our south here, around Glenpool. Or actually, the Red Fork strike was before Glenpool. I think it was like 1903 or something out near Sand Springs. Oil and mineral rights. The 5 civilized tribes made a huge mistake. When they negotiated their allotment agreements, the allotments included the minerals. The Osages, they were smart. They knew what the Osages, I'm not saying that, mineral rights stayed tribal property. And because of that, initially, the Osage people became the richest people on the planet, like the Saudis, right, for a while, until whites figured out how to get those head rights. So anyway, a lot of the surplus allotments somehow wound up in Glenpool and Red Fork and Bartlesville, right? And were easily passed into non-native hands, and soon became, incredibly valuable when oil was discovered. So anyway, any questions about that? All right, well, with regard to allotment, there were a number of lingering consequences according to your textbook author. Lingering consequences involved the checkerboarding of land, and that is a term that's actually kind of a legal term now, refers to an area in which you have a mosaic, sort of a crazy quilt of land that is restricted and land that is in fee simple, generally called fee land. You have fee land and allotted restricted allotted land. So you have little parcels of Indian country interspersed among parcels of private property. And this is the reason today, primarily because of what happened in 1934 and in Oklahoma in 1936. And that is going to have to be a subject for a different lecture, I think. Nevertheless, checkerboarding is this occurrence in most reservations where you have this mixing of parcels. And what that does is it produces all sorts of confusion of jurisdiction, especially when it comes to crime. And we've got a solution to this now, but the solution is cross-deputization in state compacts, which I've talked about before. But there are other things like the idea that today, and if you're talking an agricultural area, if you have a parcel of land that's like 40 acres in size and it's restricted, you can't sell it. It's also these days, except for maybe a few crops, it's not going to be worth trying to farm it because the parcel is really too small, especially if you're farming a small grain or something like that, or maybe even alfalfa or something like that. The parcel is typically going to be problematic because of the size, but that's not really the big problem. The lingering consequences also included the thing that the whole allotment scheme was intended to fix. The allotment was intended to be the final solution to the Indian problem. If we just make them United States citizens and give them private property, they'll finally assimilate. And we won't have these Indian tribes with all these obligations, these treaty obligations. But it didn't work like that. Allotment created a huge problem that required a larger army of people in the Indian office to take, to record and to keep track of Indian lands. Not only Indian lands, but remember we said, as Sarah kind of mentioned, can you rent the lands? Can you lease the lands? Well, yeah, you could through the Indian office. You had to have approval of the Department of the Interior in order to lease your land to some, stock raiser, cattleman. Maybe you had that 40-acre plot. Maybe you wanted to use it, for grazing. You're not going to get a lot of money out of it, but it still had to be approved by the United States Department of the Interior. Okay, so this created an enormous amount of paperwork, red tape, And the size of the Indian office mushroomed because of the allotment process, carrying out the allotment process, and then the consequences of the allotment process, or the allotment. But the biggest problem that persists today is this phenomenon known as, and it's known everywhere, as fractionation, okay? Not fracking, but fractionation. And your author says fractionalization, which I suppose means exactly the same thing, but it's a few more letters than you really need. So I'm going to stick with what the courts have called it, and that's fractionation. And the tribes call it fractionation, okay? Basically, what happens here is allottees die without valid wills. As allottees die without wills, all of that interest will be subdivided according to state, what are called intestacy laws. What that word is a legal term that refers to estate. Okay, it's int estate. And what that means is it's the state laws are going to be dividing up that property, even though the allottee may not be a state citizen. All right? Now the way that works is that if that original allottee didn't have a will, but had 4 children, according to most probate laws, whatever you want to call it, most probate courts would say, okay, the interest is divided 4 ways. So you have 25%, 25%, 25%, 25% among the children, right? Well, if, perhaps those 4 children realize that, they need to have wills, hopefully, to pass their 25% share to their children, okay? But oftentimes people die without wills. And so what would happen is, say you have three of those children pass their shares to 1 child or 2 children, okay? Well, you're going to get a division, right? So 25%, let's say, is divided twice in one case. 25% is divided maybe 6 times in another case. 25% is divided 3 times in the other case. And then one of the children dies without a will. But that child had 8 children. Okay, now that 25% share is divided 8 ways. After 2 or 3 generations, it often became, one parcel of land of, let's say, 160 acres. If it wasn't subdivided, which it could be, if it wasn't subdivided, then there may be dozens of actual heirs who have a fractional interest in that property. And if that property didn't enter the free market, didn't enter the market through having the restrictions removed or meeting the 25-year period, and by 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, or in the case of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, 1936, after those dates, any restricted land would remain restricted land forever, all right? So that restricted allotments in the state of Oklahoma may now have hundreds of, they may be divided in hundreds of ways among these heirs. All right, so what's the point of all that? Well, as you've read, it's often the case that a share in the property, even if you're able to lease the land for $2,000 a year, okay, to a cattle raiser, say you receive $2,000, or that parcel of land receives $2,000 per year in income. The Indian office is then responsible for dividing up that total income among all of the shareholders, all of the various size interests within that parcel, which is a nightmare in red tape, right? A nightmare and in many cases you've seen that, one person's share may be far less money than the postage it takes to send the letter saying you have this much money. Kind of like the royalties I get on my book. Anyway, so fractionation is a big problem today. How do you solve a problem like that? Next chapter, 4, 5, 6, right? Just to address that issue of fractionation, there have been a couple of attempts to solve the issue of fractionation, as you will have read, or maybe already read. The initial attempt was unilateral by the government when a parcel of land reached a point to which the individual interest in that property didn't exceed 1%, something like that, 2%, a small fraction. Then the parcel of land was conveyed to the tribe. It was conveyed back to the tribe. And what happened there was a lawsuit, because then you have the tribal citizen losing the allotment that they never had ownership of in the first place, and it goes back to the tribe. We didn't like that. So Congress realized, or the courts, Supreme Court realized that was an unfair taking. It was repealed, or it was revoked, declared unconstitutional. Anyway, you will have read about that initially. So let's move on to probably the most, to me, probably the most interesting of these 3 chapters. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get to lecture on it much, but I'll ask you a few questions and you can tell me about it. So who was Crow Dog?
Defendant in the murder trial on the Indian reservation.
He was a Brule Sioux, Lakota. He was, he had a long-standing feud with the chief, who was actually very much favored by the Indian office because he was compliant with a lot of things. He was a good Indian, I guess, to the government, and his name was Spotted Tail. All right, so Spotted Tail was a well-known chief, but the rumors had it that Spotted Tail was pocketing some of the revenue from the ranchers who were leasing some of the land around the reservation. And Crow Dog, had these rumors, and this was just like one more thing to hate Spotted Tail for. But it was a weird incident where Spotted Tail and a group of his buddies were coming up on Crow Dog after he had left an agency, I think it was, with his wife. And it was bad blood, but Crow Dog jumped out of his wagon with probably a 30-30, and Spotted Tail got within range, and Crow Dog just aimed and shot him, and shot him right in the chest. And he got up to try to fire his 6-shooter at Crow Dog, and he died before he could do it. So Crow Dog murdered Spotted Tail. Crow Dog admitted to that. And after a while, according to Lakota law or Lakota tradition, he made amends with the family of Spotted Tail's relatives. And what he did was he gave them a certain amount of money. I think in one source I read, well, your textbook says $600, right? Which in 2021 dollars supposedly is about $16,000. Right? So he paid the relatives of Spotted Tail some money, and also he distributed about somewhere between 2 and 6 ponies, and some what else was it? Maybe a saddle or something like that. Blanket. Okay, it's been an important blanket.
Maybe ceremonial.
But the thing was, the victim's family, they were satisfied with that. He covered perhaps what people lost, but they were okay with that. Which in my world is weird. I can't imagine that. $16,000? No. The story got out, and there were some issues. There were some issues with the Indian agent in this area, some local issues, and the local newspaper got wind of the story and published it. And everybody around, every white person around this area just thought this was crazy. This is deplorable. And this man who murdered this well-known, liked chief is just going to walk away after handing over a couple of old ponies and a blanket and a handful of income, maybe a year's income or something. And so the white readers were incensed. It eventually came to the knowledge of the Indian agent that you're looking really bad allowing this to happen. So he talked to Crow Dog, talked him into going and turning himself in at the local military post. He explained to him, it's just a formality. Let's just get this over with, make sure everything looks good. He gets there, and they throw him in the can and file first-degree murder charges against him. This is in United States District Court. So they took him, they charged him in United States District Court with first-degree murder, tried by a jury of white men, who found him guilty. Well, he wasn't arguing either. He told them he did it. But they sentenced him to death by hanging. And so eventually, the word about this, probably through the Indian agent, got to Washington. And what occurred was ex parte Crow Dog. One of the most important decisions in Indian history, American Indian history, at least legal history. Ex parte Crow Dog of 1883. The question was, and what's ex parte? Do you have any idea? Basically, the higher court demands to take charge of this lower court's case without the knowledge of the prosecuting side or the adversary. The adversary in this case being the territory and the district court. So basically, the Supreme Court grabs this, hears about this, and just grabs it. Why in the heck did that happen? Why did the Supreme Court grab this case? So the Supreme Court orders an ex parte, and Crow Dog is freed. Basically, what happened was there was an opinion written, and you can read. You read that. Okay, it's in the text. But the wording basically reasons that the United States does not have. Oh, by the way, I didn't even say the important part. Crow Dog shot Spotted Tail on Indian land. Indian kills Indian on Indian land. Is prosecuted according to Indian law, tribal law. His sentence wasn't perhaps what most people in the United States would expect, but he served his sentence, you know? So this got to the Supreme, yeah.
They wanted it because in all the wording of before, it was never specifically mentioned what a crime from an Indian on an Indian on the reservation, that was left out somehow.
That's right. There was never, according to Crow Dog, there was no federal offense for an Indian to kill another Indian on Indian land. The federal government had not reached in to define that. The Supreme Court nabbed that and brought it in and issued a finding that he is outside of the jurisdiction of the United States court system. You suppose that was just an accident? I don't. But the United States Supreme Court pulled an ex parte and freed Crow Dog. What do you think that did for the press? Oh, everybody went, obviously there's a problem here. 2 years later, Congress passes the Major Crimes Act of 1885, responding to that absurd finding by the Supreme Court, right? There was obviously a problem. The United States can't allow people to kill each other and then walk free, pretty much. So originally, this involved 7 serious, mostly violent crimes involving Indian perpetrators acting upon Indian victims within Indian country, okay? So absolutely one of the most important cases in American Indian history has everything to do with where something happened. In this case, and it happened in Indian country. So every crime on this list became the jurisdiction of the federal government, even Indian upon Indian crime in Indian country. Remember back to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Northwest Ordinance, and even before that, there was a treaty that did the same thing. And then after the Northwest Ordinance, the Trade and Intercourse Acts, right? Every one of those said, Indian crime on Indian crime in Indian country is none of our business. In fact, if our people molest your people on your property, we're not going to enforce our laws against them. You can do what you want to with them. They're not supposed to be there. A little bit of a change in that amount of time. In 100 years, basically. So basically the federal government extends its jurisdiction over all of Indian country when it comes to these so-called violent or serious crimes. By 2021, the number would increase to 30 crimes, and these were more specific, like child abuse and stuff like that. So is this unconstitutional? That would be a good question, wouldn't it? Explain how the Major Crimes Act could be argued to be unconstitutional. In the Constitution and the other documents that I mentioned, the federal government does just about everything it can to separate the business of Indian people on their own land from the United States business. Right? We didn't cover everything that is covered in the text, okay? But next time we'll talk about what? Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. And I really think that chapter, chapter 7, I think it is. Yeah, chapter 7, which is what he calls the Constitution, Treaties, and American Citizenship, or Plenary Power 2. That is a really good chapter. I'm sure you haven't read it yet. It's long, but it is an incredibly insightful chapter that opened my eyes to a number of things. But check that out next time. Well, if that's it, then we'll call it a day. That's all right. We got a good chapter coming up, okay? And read it slowly. Don't skim it. Read it slowly. Let it sink in. Think about what's going on here. You know, I've been studying this stuff since 1986 or 87. And 86 or 87. I wrote a thesis and a dissertation on these subjects. But I still am finding, mostly when I'm thinking about something, okay, you're thinking about how all this kind of fits together, and you know, you have sort of revelations. You know, I can't believe this happened. You know, this is incredible. It's incredible that Congress winds up just completely walking away from the commitments to the Constitution. The Supreme Court is just like a wet rag in a lot of these cases. They simply defer to Congress, or they defer to the executive branch and, you know, the Indian office. And also, I think you'll see that John Marshall's ideas of original Indian title and what he said about domestic dependent nations and ward guardian relationships, I think you'll find that Congress and the Indian office use those things to their great advantage to get rid of the Indian problem. That is, the Indian problem being the Indians' existence. Okay, so they twist and turn the meanings of these things over time. So anyway, see you on Wednesday, and have a great evening and drive safely.